Welcome students to Unit 13, the lecture for Culturally Responsive Teaching. Today we'll be talking about student diversity in all its forms. We'll be talking a little bit about stereotype threat, implicit bias, and discussing classroom strategies for culturally competent teaching. First, let's talk about student diversity. When you teach in a classroom, particularly in New York, you will be teaching many different types of students. What does it mean to be diverse? Many people think that diversity refers to racial diversity or ethnic diversity, but in reality, students are diverse from each other in many different ways. Here's a chart showing you some of the ways that students may differ from one another. They may differ in terms of religion. They may differ in terms of whether they're disabled or they belong to a non-disabled group. Ethnicity, as we're going to see, is different than race. Students may differ from each other in terms of social class, in terms of sex or gender, and other ways as well. In this lecture, we'll be covering not all of those elements, but a few of the elements of diversity. Specifically, we'll be discussing socioeconomic status, or social class, culture, race and ethnicity, and gender. First, let's discuss socioeconomic status and discuss the impact of social class on student achievement. What does SES or socioeconomic status refer to? Usually it refers to an individual's income, their occupation, their education, and their prestige in society. If we say someone is from an upper SES, it means generally they make a lot of money, they have a college education, they have a white-collar job, and they have some prestige in society. Middle class can mean that as well, but generally it means that the individual makes less money. Lower or working class generally means, you might have heard the term blue collar. That means that they work in a service industry, for example, in manufacturing, or perhaps they're struggling for employment. These have become terms that we use over the years. They're not necessarily fair terms, but if you hear them, I want you to know what they mean. Let's discuss the role of child rearing practices in outcomes. If you're struggling to put food on the table, you might not have as much time to spend on educating or enriching your child. Therefore, many children who come from low-income families receive an upbringing that is less consistent with expected school behavior than do middle-class families. An important difference between middle-income and lower-income families is the kinds of activities parents tend to do with the children. Frequently, in upper or middle-class families, the mothers or sometimes fathers may stay home with the children. They may receive more enriching activities. For example, they may be read to more often, talked to more often. Because these families may have more disposable income, they may go on trips more often. It is difficult for a child from an impoverished background to compete with some of these experiences. And these experiences definitely play out in terms of school outcome. Students who have received these enriching experiences are more likely to do well in school. Let's think for a minute about school and community factors. You are probably aware that school funding in most areas of the United States comes from three sources: federal funding, state funding, and local property taxes. However, you may not be aware that federal funding is actually a small part of the school's budget. State funding and local property taxes make up the majority of the school's budget. Now let's think about this. If the local property taxes in an area are lower because lower income people live there, it makes sense that the schools would have less money to do the things they need to do. Therefore, schools in impoverished areas tend to be more impoverished. They tend to have older textbooks. They tend to have older buildings. They may not have some of the amenities of middle and upper class schools. Because so much of the funding comes from local property taxes, middle and upper income children are more likely to attend schools with greater resources, better paid teachers, and other advantages. How does this all translate? It means that low SES children suffer from deficits. For example, they have less access to quality health care, vision impairment, more hearing problems. They may be exposed to lead in old paints that used to contain lead. They may have high rates of asthma. They're less likely to receive medical care, especially if their parents don't have insurance. Unhealthy diets are common. They may live in food deserts where access to a grocery store is curtailed. We have seen so far in this lecture how low-income students, low SES students, are disadvantaged. Another difference between students is race versus ethnicity. And it's important to distinguish between these two terms. Ethnicity is a constructed term. By that, we mean that the students share an identity with a common culture. Race is a classification based on ancestry or genetics. The bullets you see in front of you are the U.S. federal designations of race: American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. These are based on genetics. Ethnicity is more based on culture. So you might say, I'm Hispanic, and mean I'm of the Hispanic culture. That's an ethnic group. However, being Black or African American is a racial category. Racial categories are somewhat problematic, however, because as DNA analysis has unfolded in the 21st century, we find that we are not one race or another race. Most of us have DNA from different races in our DNA, so most of us are a mix of races. When we talk about race versus ethnicity, it's important to understand the term underrepresented groups. In education, when we discuss underrepresented groups, we're referring to groups that are found less often in situations of economic security and power. For example, we might say that women are an underrepresented group in STEM, in certain areas of STEM, especially physics and astronomy. On the other hand, we might say that blacks are an underrepresented group in corporate CEOs. So underrepresented group can change its meaning in terms of the context. When we discuss underrepresented groups in terms of education and students, we find that generally underrepresented groups tend to score lower on all standardized forms of assessment due to factors related to nurture. We know that all racial groups and all ethnic groups are equally competent when given the similar types of backgrounds and experiences. However, recall that poverty is a factor that leads to lower school achievement. Many underrepresented groups come from backgrounds of poverty. Let's discuss gender as a factor in students' education. Here, it's important to distinguish between the terms sex and gender. A child's sex is a visible attribute usually given at birth. It may be changed, as we know as we discuss and think about transgender individuals. However, gender is more socially constructed. So a child's sex is the sex that's assigned to them. Gender is more of a social construct that has social implications. Cross-cultural research indicates that gender roles are among the first that individuals learn. We know that across continents, across countries, children learn gender roles. They play house, they play where daddy goes out to work, and this is consistent throughout the nations. We also know that all societies treat males differently from females. This has been well researched. It therefore follows that what is considered natural behavior is likely based more on cultural belief than on biological differences. So the question we're trying to get at here is, do little girls play house with dolls because they're naturally more nurturing, or because it's been taught from very young ages? We're talking 2 years old, for example, that's the role they're supposed to play. Here's what the research reveals about gender differences in the classroom. We know there are few differences between boys and girls in intellectual ability. We do know that males tend to score higher on general knowledge, on standardized tests, mechanical reasoning, and mental rotation measures. This mental rotation measure refers to those problems, for example, on the SAT, where you take a figure and you mentally rotate it and then circle the answer of the matching or corresponding figure. Males have a slight edge in that ability. Males also have a higher rate of learning disabilities and emotional disorders. They tend to score at the high end and the low ends of the intellectual curve. Females tend to score more towards the middle, clustered more towards the middle. What that means is that you tend to have more male geniuses and more males at the significantly lower ends of the IQ. Females tend to be more in the middle. However, research does not support gender differences in instruction. By this I mean it's not important to teach math in a certain way to boys and as opposed to girls. It may be more important to contextualize your math problems so that there are things of interest to girls. But in terms of actually how you instruct it, for example, using algorithms or direct instruction or constructivist instruction, it doesn't make a difference. Let's discuss culture for a minute. Culture is the sum total of an individual's experiences, knowledge, skills, belief, values, and interests. Cultural expectations can create different ideas of what is considered acceptable. So, for example, if you are raised in a culture where it's considered impolite to speak back to adults, you might find that coming to the United States is a culture shock because that value isn't something that we grasp here or something that we promote. These cultural differences can create friction in the classroom if you're not aware of them. Here are a couple of examples of cultural differences in the classroom. South Korean students may fear making a mistake, may look down when speaking to you, and may be overly competitive. If you have a South Korean student and you see that student looking down, you may feel that they are shy or disrespectful, when in reality, that may be how they've been taught to approach adult authority figures. Native American students tend to be cooperative and value society over individualism. They may want to share and help each other out to the point where you're worried about them being able to do it on their own. As we've said, we have many different types of students in our classroom with many diverse learning needs. It's important that we try to meet our students' diverse needs because this is grounding in a concept called equity. I like this illustration because it shows you the difference between equality and equity. Equality means everyone gets exactly the same thing. But what if everyone is not equal in terms of their previous experiences? Low-income students, for example, might not have had the enriching experiences of being raised in a family where the mother stayed at home and read to the children constantly. That child may need more of a boost. Equity means giving individual students the things that they need so that everyone can achieve at an equal rate. The second picture on the right shows each child getting the number of boxes they need to be able to see over the fence. Equality versus equity. The New York State Education Department, NYSED, has developed a culturally responsive sustaining education framework that contains best practices for how you may address students' diverse needs in the classroom. You will take a look at it during one of the assignments in this week's module. The framework is organized into 4 principles of culturally responsive sustaining education. The first principle is to make a welcoming and affirming environment for all students. The second principle is to have high expectations and rigorous instruction. The third principle is to make the curriculum and assessment in your classroom inclusive. And the fourth principle is to participate in ongoing professional learning. I'm going to add 5 of my own practices to teach with cultural competency. The first is get to know your students, understand their cultural background, understand their home life. You can do this with icebreakers, or you can also do it with surveys about student interests, responsibilities outside of school, opinions about ineffective and effective teachers. These surveys are all over the internet. Find the ones that work for you and give them in the first couple of days of school. Step 2 is to be aware of your own personal implicit biases. And we're going to talk about implicit biases more in a minute. But basically it means, how do you look at other groups? The third step is to transform your curriculum. Some of your curriculum should reflect the diversity in your classroom. For example, if you are an ELA teacher and you teach primarily Hispanic students, be sure to include texts about Hispanic children and adults in your curriculum. Use meaningful assignments so that students will understand that learning has a purpose. Use assignments that force students to think critically and challenge the status quo. And assess using a wide variety of assessments. Don't just rely on tests and quizzes. The fourth practice is to respect and reinforce student culture. If you have a certain group in your classroom, find out what the cultural expectations are for children in that culture. And finally, involve the family and the community. Invite parents to complete a survey about their child. Communicate with families regularly, not just when there's a discipline issue. One good idea is to make one good call home every day. I used to do this after school. I used to call parents and say, I just want to tell you something your child did that's wonderful today. Send written notices home in the language of the family and find a translator for meetings if possible. Make sure there's funding available for extra expenses, such as if your class goes on a field trip. Let's switch gears for a moment and talk about a couple of important concepts that have to do with teaching diverse students. The first is stereotype threat. A stereotype threat refers to the phenomenon about perceptions about oneself. Individuals who are aware of a stereotype about a group to which they belong may become anxious about confirming the stereotype. Their anxiety causes them to perform below their real abilities. This makes the stereotype threat a great concern for members of underrepresented groups. A famous study took place in which researchers recruited participants of girls and divided them up into two rooms. They told the girls they would be given a math test. In the first room, the control room, they entered the room and they said, "Girls, here is your math test." In the second room, the experimental room, they entered the room and they said, "Girls, here is your math test. It's been shown that boys and girls do the same on this test." Guess what happened? The girls in the experimental room outperformed the girls in the control room. In other words, the girls who were told girls and boys perform the same did better than the girls that didn't get that instruction. The reason that this happened is girls are a member of an underrepresented group and often feel math anxiety. Many girls believe that they can't do math as well as boys. This is an example of a belief about themselves, a stereotype, that threatens their ability to do math. This experiment showed that girls can do math as well as boys, if they're told so. Another concept is implicit bias. Whereas stereotype threats had to do with belief about a group that you belong to yourself, implicit biases are often subtle, often subconscious stereotypes that guide our expectations and interactions with other people. So implicit biases have to do with our beliefs about other groups. As you can imagine, implicit biases are harmful to our teaching. We all have them, by the way. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're prejudiced. It just means you have certain beliefs that you may not even be aware of. In this module, you're going to do a little more work to discover what your implicit bias may be. But what can we do as teachers to avoid bias in our teaching? Teachers, usually without being aware of it, exhibit bias in two principal ways: reinforcing existing stereotypes, our beliefs about others, and treating students differently based on their membership in a group. Here are some specific strategies to overcome personal bias in teaching. Avoid stereotypes. For example, assign jobs in the classroom without regard to gender. I have seen examples of students sent out on field trips where the boys get to do more physically active things than the girls. That's an example of assigning based on gender. Maintain high expectations for all students, no matter what groups they're from. Promote integration of different types of students. Encourage collaboration, seating across groups, and participation in sports activities by everyone. Make a conscious effort to treat students equally. Allow all students equal opportunities to participate in class, to take leadership roles, and to engage in all kinds of activities. Call on students equally. Develop a system to ensure that you call on students about the same number of times. Some teachers will put children's names in a container and pull them out. I know there are random name calling apps that deal with this now. Whatever system you choose to use, make sure you're calling on the shy students who sit there as frequently as the ones that call out. Be concerned for all students' welfare and respect students' differences. That's really what it comes down to, being sensitive and having a respect for student diversity. Here is a summary of what we've learned in this lecture. Students are diverse in many ways: SES, race, ethnicity, gender, culture, and more. To be equitable, we must address students' diverse needs. Teaching with cultural competency allows us to address those needs. NYSED has developed a culturally responsive sustaining framework with guiding practices for culturally competent teaching. Stereotype threat is when a member of a group feels disadvantaged because of stereotypes others may have. Implicit bias is when we make implicit assumptions about different groups. Finally, we should try to be aware of our own implicit biases and make efforts to overcome them. Thank you. I hope this lecture has taught you about culturally responsive teaching.